On March 28, 1922, Andreas Gruber stood at the edge of his farmyard, staring at the fresh snow that blanketed his property. The 63-year-old Bavarian farmer was troubled by what he saw, a set of footprints leading from the dark forest across his fields straight to his farmhouse. The tracks were clear and deliberate, made by someone who had approached his isolated homestead in the dead of night. But what chilled Andreas to the bone wasn't just the presence of the footprints, it was their absence. The tracks led to the farm, but none led away. 3 days later, on the evening of March 31st, 1922, Andreas would be dead, along with 5 other people who called the remote farmstead of Hinterkaifeck home. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, 6 inhabitants of a small Bavarian farmstead, commonly referred to today as Hinterkaifeck, were murdered by an unknown assailant. More than a century later, this brutal mass murder remains Germany's most baffling and disturbing unsolved case, one that seems to belong more to the realm of horror fiction than historical fact. What makes the Hinterkaifeck murders so uniquely terrifying isn't just the brutality of the killings, but the inexplicable circumstances surrounding them. The evidence suggests that the murderer may have been living in the family's attic for days or even weeks before the attack, watching, waiting, and planning. After committing 6 murders, the killer appears to have remained on the property for several days, calmly going about daily farm chores while surrounded by corpses. On a quiet Bavarian farmstead in 1922, 6 people were slaughtered in the dead of night. More than a century later, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain Germany's most baffling and haunting unsolved crime. The isolated farm, situated between the towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich, became the scene of a massacre that would defy explanation and haunt investigators for generations. The Gruber family, who lived at Hinterkaifeck, consisted of Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, Gabriel, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Josef. Also living on the farm was Maria Baumgartner, the new maid who had only been employed for a few hours before becoming a victim herself. These 6 individuals would all be dead by dawn on April 1st, 1922, killed by someone who had been systematically preparing for their murders. The strange events that preceded the Hinterkaifeck murders began months before the actual killings and created an atmosphere of mounting dread that the family seemed unable to escape. In the months prior to the killings, strange occurrences were reported in and around Hinterkaifeck. Crescenz Rieger, the Gruber family's original maid, had quit about 6 months before the murders. It has been widely claimed that Rieger's reason for leaving was that she had heard strange noises in the attic, believing the house to be haunted. The former maid's reports of supernatural activity would later take on sinister significance. Their previous maid had quit 6 months earlier, claiming the house was haunted. She spoke of hearing footsteps and voices when no one else was around. What Rieger had interpreted as ghostly manifestations were likely the sounds of a very human presence, someone who had found a way to infiltrate the family's home and was using their attic as a hiding place. The escalation of strange events continued into March 1922. In March 1922, Andreas found a strange newspaper from Munich on the property that he could not remember purchasing, initially believing that the postman had lost the paper. This was not the case, however, as no one in the vicinity subscribed to the newspaper. The appearance of the Munich newspaper was particularly unsettling because it suggested someone with urban connections was monitoring the isolated farm, someone who didn't belong in the rural Bavarian countryside. Even more disturbing were the reports of missing keys and tools. He also heard unexplained noises in the attic, and a set of keys to the house mysteriously went missing. These incidents created a pattern that suggests systematic preparation for what was to come. Someone was learning the layout of the farm, studying the family's routines, and ensuring they would have access when the time came to strike. The footprints Andreas discovered on March 28th were the most ominous sign yet. In the days leading up to the killings, Andreas Gruber reported to neighbors about discovering peculiar footprints in the snow. These tracks led from the edge of the forest to the farm, but eerily, there were no tracks leading away. This physical evidence suggested that whoever had approached the farm under cover of darkness was still there, hiding somewhere on the property. Despite these increasingly alarming incidents, the Gruber family made no attempt to contact police or seek help from neighbors. This decision would prove fatal and raises questions about why they didn't recognize the escalating danger. Some historians suggest that Andreas Gruber was a proud and stubborn man who refused to admit he needed assistance. Others theorize that the family may have suspected they knew their stalker's identity and believed they could handle the situation themselves. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, the Gruber family followed their normal routine, unaware that it would be their last. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, had arrived that very day to replace Crescens Rieger. Her timing couldn't have been more tragic. She had been in the house for only a few hours when the killer struck. The murder sequence began in the barn, where Andreas had gone to tend to the animals for the evening. The killer approached from behind and struck him down with a mattock, a heavy agricultural tool used for breaking up soil. The weapon choice was significant, suggesting either premeditation, the killer had selected an appropriate tool, or opportunity, the mattock was readily available on the farm. After killing Andreas, the murderer waited for other family members to investigate his absence. Casilia Gruber, the grandmother, came looking for her husband and was immediately struck down. 7-year-old Casilia followed, perhaps calling for her grandfather, and she too was murdered. Finally, Victoria Gabriel, the children's mother, ventured into the barn and became the 4th victim found there. 4 of the victims, Andreas, Casilia Sr., Victoria, and little Casilia, were found in the barn, stacked on top of each other, covered in hay. This arrangement of bodies suggests the killer took time after the murders to organize the crime scene. The covering with hay indicates an attempt to conceal the bodies, though whether this was to hide evidence or to prevent discovery by the remaining victims is unclear. The killer then moved into the house proper, where 2 victims remained. Inside the house, Maria Baumgartner and Joseph were found murdered in their respective sleeping areas. Maria, the unfortunate maid, was killed in her bedroom, while 2-year-old Joseph was murdered in his bed. The final victim was young Joseph, who was struck just once, killing him instantly. The methodical nature of the killings, moving from the barn to systematically eliminate everyone in the house, suggests a killer who was completely familiar with the property layout and the family's routines. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity, but a carefully planned execution carried out with ruthless efficiency. What happened next transforms the Hinterkaifeck case from a tragic multiple murder into something far more sinister and psychologically disturbing. Evidence suggests that after killing all 6 inhabitants, the murderer didn't flee the scene. Instead, they appear to have made themselves at home, living among the corpses for several days while carrying out normal farm activities. Neighbors later reported seeing smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney in the days following the murders. The farm animals were fed and cared for, and there were signs that someone had been eating meals in the kitchen. As it was determined the victims were all murdered the previous day, this meant that someone, again most likely the killer, had torn off the March 31st, 1922 page from a calendar, suggesting they were maintaining some semblance of normal routine even while surrounded by their victims' bodies. This behavior goes far beyond typical criminal conduct and enters the realm of severe psychological dysfunction. The killer's ability to live calmly in a house with 6 decomposing corpses while performing everyday tasks suggests either complete emotional detachment or severe mental illness, possibly both. The discovery of the bodies came on April 4, 1922, 4 days after the murders. Neighbors became concerned when none of the family appeared at church or in town, and 7-year-old Kazilia failed to attend school. When a search party approached the farm, they found the horrific scene that would become legendary in German criminal history. The initial investigation was hampered by the primitive forensic techniques available in 1922. Crime scene photography was rudimentary, fingerprinting was not yet standard practice, and there was no understanding of psychological profiling or behavioral evidence. Investigators had to rely primarily on physical evidence, witness testimony, and logical deduction. Despite these limitations, several crucial pieces of evidence emerged. The murder weapon, a mattock, was found at the scene, but it yielded no useful clues about the killer's identity. More significantly, investigators discovered that someone had been living in the house after the murders, confirming neighbors' reports about the chimney smoke and the cared-for animals. The crime scene itself told a story of systematic murder, followed by inexplicable behavior. The arrangement of bodies in the barn suggested the killer had taken time to organize the scene. The fact that the house showed signs of habitation after the murders indicated someone with either supreme confidence or complete indifference to the gravity of their crimes. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the apparent lack of robbery motive. Money and valuables remained untouched in the house, ruling out theft as a primary motivation. This suggested the murders were either personal, targeting the family specifically, or the work of someone whose motivations transcended normal criminal logic. The investigation identified numerous suspects over the years, but none could be definitively linked to the crimes. The most prominent theories focused on individuals with known connections to the family or grievances against them. However, the bizarre post-murder behavior, living among the corpses, didn't fit the profile of someone motivated by personal revenge or financial gain. Local rumors centered on various possibilities: a disgruntled former employee, a rejected suitor of Victoria Gabriel, or even a family member with a hidden motive. Some theories suggested the involvement of Victoria's former husband, who had allegedly deserted during World War I and might have returned secretly. However, no evidence ever substantiated these speculations. The investigation was further complicated by the social and economic chaos of post-World War I Germany. Record-keeping was inconsistent, populations were mobile due to economic displacement, and local authorities were overwhelmed with more pressing concerns than a rural murder case. These factors allowed potentially crucial evidence to be lost and witnesses to disappear. Over the decades, the case has been re-examined multiple times using increasingly sophisticated techniques. In the 1950s, investigators used improved fingerprinting methods to reanalyze evidence. In the 1980s and 2000s, advanced forensic techniques were applied to remaining physical evidence. However, the passage of time and the primitive nature of the original crime scene work have limited the effectiveness of these modern approaches. Recent DNA analysis has been attempted on preserved evidence, but contamination and degradation have prevented any conclusive results. The case demonstrates how crucial proper crime scene management is for long-term investigative success, a lesson that wasn't yet understood in 1922. From a criminological perspective, the Hinterkaifeck murders present several unique features that distinguish them from typical multiple homicides. The extended planning period suggested by the strange pre-murder events indicates an organized killer with significant patience and self-control. The systematic execution of all 6 victims shows methodical thinking and thorough preparation. Most unusually, the post-murder behavior suggests psychological characteristics that don't fit standard criminal profiles. The ability to remain calm while surrounded by decomposing victims indicates either extreme compartmentalization or complete emotional detachment. This behavior is more consistent with severe mental illness than with typical criminal motivation. The case also highlights the vulnerability of isolated rural families in an era before modern communication and transportation. The Gruber family's isolation, which they likely valued for privacy and independence, became a liability that allowed a predator to stalk them undetected and commit mass murder without fear of interruption. The social impact of the Hinterkaifeck murders extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. The case became a touchstone for discussions about rural safety and the vulnerability of isolated families. It influenced German attitudes toward home security and demonstrated the need for better communication between rural communities and law enforcement. The murders also became part of German folklore, inspiring countless books, documentaries, and films. The farmhouse itself was demolished in 1923, but the site remains a pilgrimage destination for true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators. The case has achieved a cultural significance that extends far beyond its criminal historical importance. Modern psychological analysis of the case has focused on the killer's apparent ability to compartmentalize extreme violence with normal daily activities. The post-murder behavior suggests either dissociative disorder, severe antisocial personality disorder, or possibly a form of organized psychosis that allowed rational planning alongside extreme criminal behavior. The extended stalking period before the murders indicates someone with significant psychological investment in the family or the location. This wasn't a random crime or a crime of opportunity, but a carefully planned assault on specific victims in a specific place. The killer's motivation remains one of the case's greatest mysteries. Some modern profilers have suggested that the killer may have been someone with legitimate reasons to be near the farm, a tradesman, delivery person, or itinerant worker who could approach without arousing suspicion. This would explain how they managed to surveil the family and access their property without detection. The case has also been examined in the context of post-World War I trauma and social displacement. Germany in 1922 was struggling with massive unemployment, social upheaval, and psychological trauma from the war. Some theories suggest the killer may have been a displaced veteran suffering from what we would now recognize as PTSD, though this doesn't explain the calculated nature of the crimes. Today, more than a century after the murders, the Hinterkaifeck case continues to generate new theories and attract investigators. Advanced forensic techniques continue to be applied to the remaining evidence, though the passage of time has severely limited what can be recovered. DNA analysis, advanced ballistics, and psychological profiling have all been attempted, but the primitive state of the original investigation limits their effectiveness. The case remains officially unsolved, though various individuals have been proposed as suspects over the decades. Without new physical evidence or witness testimony, the truth about what happened at Hinterkaifeck will likely remain forever hidden. The killer, if they survived the chaotic years of the Weimar Republic and Nazi Germany, almost certainly died long ago, taking their secrets with them. The victims, Andreas Gruber, his wife Casilia, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, grandchildren Casilia and Joseph, and the unfortunate maid Maria Baumgartner, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in an unsolved case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by incomprehensible evil. Their tragedy became part of German criminal history, but their humanity should not be forgotten in the fascination with their killer's mystery. The farmstead where they lived and died no longer exists, demolished within a year of the murders. However, the location is marked, and the story of what happened there continues to fascinate people around the world. Hinterkaifeck represents something that challenges our understanding of human nature, the idea that someone could plan and execute such calculated evil, then live calmly among the results of their actions. The case stands as a reminder that some mysteries may never be solved, some evil may never be understood, and some questions about human nature may never be answered. In the rolling countryside of Bavaria, where the Hinterkaifeck farm once stood, the wind still carries whispers of Germany's most disturbing unsolved crime. A case that proved that reality can be far more terrifying than any horror story ever imagined. The Matic that killed 6 innocent people was eventually destroyed, but the questions it raised about human capacity for evil remain as sharp as ever. More than 100 years later, the Hinterkaifeck murders continue to haunt not just Germany, but anyone who confronts the uncomfortable truth that monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they hide in attics, watch from forests, and strike when their victims are most vulnerable and least prepared to defend themselves.